My name is Lauren Carter. I'm 29 years old, and the day I walked into that courtroom, my parents were already smiling like they'd won a prize they hadn't earned. They sat at the plaintiff's table in tailored suits, leaning toward each other with the same camera-ready grins they used on television, certain no one would believe the daughter they left behind decades ago over the glamorous couple America thought it knew. The room was hushed, the air heavy with perfume paper and judgment, and every step I took across that polished floor sounded louder than it should have. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face stayed still. I'd learned a long time ago that you can feel terrified and still keep walking. When the judge looked up and really saw me, he froze his hand resting on the file like it suddenly weighed 100 pounds. "You're Walter Carter's granddaughter," he said quietly, and the way he said my grandfather's name made my parents' smiles finally crack at the edges. In that moment, with the past staring back at me from the bench, I knew the story they'd built around me was about to come apart. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground against people who were supposed to love you. I wasn't always Lauren Carter, the heiress in headlines, or the woman people whisper about in courthouse hallways. I was born Lauren Blake, the only child of two people who cared far more about how they looked on a screen than how they lived inside their own home. We never stayed in one place very long when I was small. My earliest memories are of cramped apartments with thin walls, suitcases half-packed in the hallway, and my mother talking to casting agents in a voice that was always a little too bright. My father could charm anyone at a party, but at home he paced the living room with a phone pressed to his ear, muttering about deals, ratings, and the next big thing. There weren't many toys, not many photos taped to the fridge, but there were mirrors everywhere, and stacks of glossy magazines spread across the coffee table. I learned early that quiet didn't mean peace. It just meant no one was paying attention to me. On the day everything changed, I was 5 years old and holding a stuffed rabbit that had already lost one button eye. They drove me up the coast from our latest apartment to Santa Barbara, where the road curved along the cliffs and the air smelled like salt and hot asphalt. When the car turned through a set of iron gates taller than any building I'd ever seen, my fingers tightened around my rabbit's worn fur. Ahead of us, a pale stone mansion rose up against the sky windows, shining balcony railings bright in the afternoon sun. It felt like another world, a place that belonged in the movies my mother cried over when she didn't get the part. I remember thinking we must be visiting someone important, someone they wanted to impress. The heat that afternoon wrapped around everything like a blanket. My mother stepped out of the car in a white sundress that fluttered around her knees, sunglasses perched on top of her perfectly styled hair. She smelled like lilacs and hairspray as she knelt in front of me on the gravel. "Be good for your grandpa." "Okay, sweetheart," she said. Her smile stretched just a little too tight, as if it might tear. My father was already on the other side of the car tapping the hood, his eyes flicking from his watch to the front door, as if the house itself were running late. "Monica, we're going to miss the flight," he called, his voice sharp. That was the first time I heard the word flight that day. I remember tugging on the hem of her dress and asking where we were going, my chest tight with a fear I didn't know how to name. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "It's just a quick trip, baby," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "We'll be back before you know it." She didn't wrap me in a hug the way other mothers did at school drop-off. She leaned in and kissed the air near my cheek, her earrings brushing my skin as she pulled away. I watched her walk back to the passenger side, her heels clicking on the stone like a countdown I didn't understand. The car door slammed, the engine roared, and the silver sedan rolled backwards, then turned toward the open gates. For a second, I thought they would stop and wave, that my mother would lower the window and blow me a kiss that my father would call something playful over the engine's noise. But the car just kept going, bright metal shrinking, as it followed the curve of the drive, taillights flashing once before it disappeared behind the trees. I ran after them as fast as my short legs could manage over gravel too sharp for the thin soles of my shoes. The world turned into sunlight dust and the sour smell of exhaust. My rabbit slipped from my hand, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I remember the sting in my lungs, the way my throat burned when I screamed Mom and Dad until the words sounded wrong in my own ears. There was no answer, just the wind rushing in from the ocean and the distant cry of gulls riding the air above the cliffs. By the time I stumbled to a stop, tears streaking the dust on my cheeks, the driveway was empty. The gates had already swung shut. A hand settled gently on my shoulder, large and steady, the weight of it grounding me where I stood. I turned and looked up into a face I barely knew. Gray hair combed back neatly, lines etched deep around the eyes, a jaw that had seen more decisions than smiles. Walter Carter knelt down, so we were eye to eye, his knees probably protesting the hard gravel, but he didn't wince. "They don't understand what they've done," he said quietly, brushing dirt from my knees with a hand that smelled faintly of paper and aftershave. His voice wasn't loud, but there was something in it that made the world stop spinning for just a second. He lifted my chin so I had to look at him instead of the empty road. "You won't be unwanted again, Lauren," he said. "Not while I have breath in my body." He picked up my stuffed rabbit, dusted it off with a kind of careful respect that made my chest ache, and then scooped me up as if I weighed almost nothing at all. My head rested against his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt crisp against my cheek. His heart beat slow and steady under my ear. As he carried me toward the house, past the manicured shrubs and the fountain that caught the afternoon light, the mansion didn't seem quite as cold or overwhelming. Inside, the ceilings were high and the hallways wide, but there was a warmth in the way his footsteps echoed calm and unhurried. That night he boiled milk on the stove himself, stirring cocoa into a mug and adding more marshmallows when he saw the way my eyes followed the bag. There were maids who could have done it, but he waved them away, setting the mug in front of me at the big kitchen island, as if this were the most important task in the world. Later, when he tucked me into a bed that felt too big for one small girl, the house was almost too quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock down the hall sounded like footsteps that never reached my door. I stared at the dark ceiling and whispered, "Will they come back for me?" The words barely made it past my lips. Walter sat on the edge of the mattress and smoothed my hair back from my forehead. He took a long breath before he answered the kind a man takes when he refuses to lie but doesn't want to hurt a child. Sometimes he said a door closes because it was never meant to open again. His gaze softened, and for the first time that day, he smiled, not the quick, polite smile he'd worn for the funeral home or the lawyers, but something deeper. "You don't have to chase anyone's love anymore, Lauren," he added. "From now on, it lives right here." His hand closed gently around mine, and I held on as the shadows stretched across the room. Somewhere beyond the windows, the ocean rolled against the base of the cliffs, steady and endless. I didn't understand everything that had happened, not really. I only knew that my parents had driven away and not looked back, and that this man who shared my last name now was promising me a different kind of life. That was the night I stopped waiting to hear their car in the driveway and started listening for his footsteps instead. I had no way of knowing that promise made in a quiet bedroom at the edge of the Pacific would one day carry me all the way into a courtroom where those same people would try to take everything he left me, starting with my name. The night my grandfather promised I would never have to chase anyone's love again settled over that house like a blanket, and from then on my life followed a rhythm marked by his quiet habits. Most mornings began before sunrise with a soft knock on my bedroom door and the smell of fresh coffee drifting down the hallway. I would come into this kitchen rubbing sleep from my eyes, and he would already be seated at the island with the newspaper unfolded, tapping the corners of articles he wanted me to read. At first, I only skimmed the headlines, trying to keep up with the stories he thought mattered, but over time, I learned to look beyond the words and find the questions he expected me to ask. Those mornings shaped how I viewed the world, although at the time they felt like nothing more than just another part of our routine. After breakfast, the house shifted into a different kind of quiet. The staff moved through the rooms with soft voices adjusting drapes, polishing tables, setting flowers in vases along the hall. I stayed close to my grandfather whenever I could, returning the books he finished sorting through papers on his desk, or following him to the backyard, where he liked to walk the perimeter before settling into his study. He wasn't a man who spoke without purpose, so when he did speak, I paid attention. Sometimes he would point out the ships moving along the horizon and explain how freight routes worked, or he would describe a case from his years on the bench without naming the people involved. These stories weren't dramatic. They were measured thoughtful the way he was, with everything he cared about. As I grew older, he allowed me to see more of the world he had built. When I was 10, he brought me to his downtown office for the first time. The building rose above the city in clean glass lines, and inside the lobby, the air was cool and steady, carrying the quiet hum of productivity. He introduced me to everyone from reception to the executive floor, not as a child tagging along, but as someone he wanted them to know. "This is my granddaughter Lauren," he would say, resting a hand on my shoulder. "One day she'll see more clearly than most adults do." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but the way people straightened when he spoke made his words feel like something I wanted to grow into. Weekends were different. Instead of staying at the mansion or the office, he drove us to the community center he funded a few miles inland. It was a plain brick building with a faded parking lot, but inside the rooms were filled with energy kids doing homework at long folding tables, volunteers preparing for workshops, the hum of conversations that carried a mix of hope and exhaustion. My grandfather didn't sweep in with a grand gesture or make speeches. He walked from table to table, offering quiet help with math problems or explaining how interest rates work to teenagers trying to understand their first bank accounts. I sat beside him, mimicking his patience, passing out pencils, or reading instructions to younger children who struggled with them. Those hours never felt like charity. They felt like an extension of our home life, only shared with more people. Years continued like that. School, home, early mornings, with the newspaper weekends at the center, all of it forming a steady foundation. It wasn't until I turned 16 that something shifted. One evening, I was in the den flipping through channels when I stopped at a red carpet event broadcast live from Los Angeles. The hosts spoke in excited tones about a new reality series featuring a couple looking for their second chance at love. The camera panned as the couple arrived, greeting reporters with practiced ease. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing. Monica and Daniel Blake, my parents, walked under the bright lights, smiling wide as photographers called their names. My mother wore a gown that shimmered like water, and my father adjusted his cufflinks as if he belonged in that world. They looked polished, cheerful, untouched by the past. My grandfather stepped into the room just as I lowered the remote. He glanced at the screen, his face unreadable, then asked, "Do you miss them?" There was no accusation in his tone, no expectation, just a question. I looked at the couple laughing with reporters, felt the distance between the life they lived and the one they left behind, and shook my head. He nodded, reached for the remote, and clicked off the television. "Good," he said gently. "There is no sense staring at closed doors." His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty, and I found myself holding on to those words long after the room went still again. Later that night, he visited my room carrying a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn at the edges, and the pages inside were blank. He handed it to me as though it carried more weight than the size suggested. "This is for your truth," he said. "Write what matters before the world tries to write it for you." I didn't fully grasp what he meant then, but I promised I would use it. That journal would become the place I kept notes, questions, and moments I didn't want to forget, not knowing it would one day become evidence of the life we built together. The years after that passed with a steady calm, although I noticed more signs of his age creeping in. He moved a little slower in the mornings, held the railing a beat longer when we climbed the stairs, or paused to catch his breath when he rose from his favorite chair. But his mind remained sharp, his voice steady, and he never let fatigue stop him from guiding me the way he always had. I didn't dwell on the changes, the way his hands trembled sometimes, or how he lingered longer over his letters at the desk. I told myself he was simply tired, that people his age earned the right to slow down. Looking back, the signs had been there for a while, subtle but present. On the morning he died, the air felt strangely still, as if the house itself sensed something was different. I walked down the hallway toward his study, expecting to find the familiar sound of a turning page or the faint scratch of his pen. Instead, the door was slightly ajar, and the room was quiet. He sat at his desk, glasses resting halfway down the bridge of his nose, his head bowed over an open journal. For a moment, I thought he had fallen asleep while reading something he occasionally joked about. But as I stepped closer, the silence became heavy, and the stillness around him felt final. The journal lay open to a page with a single line written in his careful handwriting. I didn't read it then. I only saw the shape of the letters before my vision blurred. The days that followed moved with a strange mix of motion and stillness. Phone calls came from people who had known him for decades, judges, colleagues, community leaders, and old friends who spoke in subdued tones. The staff moved through the house as though trying to keep everything perfectly in place. The funeral drew a crowd larger than I expected. People filled the pews, whispering stories about his kindness, his discipline, his unwavering sense of fairness. I stood near the front, listening as his name passed from one stranger's mouth to another, watching photographers and dignitaries try to place themselves near the man they had admired. It was during the quiet after the service that I saw Monica and Daniel standing a few rows back. They wore black designer outfits and dark sunglasses, their hands clasped together as if they were simply another grieving couple. I hadn't seen them in more than 20 years. For a moment, I didn't breathe. They approached with slow, practiced steps, removing their sunglasses in unison. My mother tilted her head, studying me as if she were looking at a painting she barely recognized. "Lauren," she said softly, almost sweetly, "you look so grown up." Her voice held a softness I didn't remember, but it didn't reach her eyes. My father stood just behind her, his expression unreadable. Before I could respond, Philip Garner asked everyone to gather at the estate office for the reading of the will. The crowd shifted toward the side room where a long wooden table waited. I followed alongside people who had known my grandfather professionally long before I was born, their quiet conversations blending with the rustle of papers and the soft scrape of chairs moving. I took a seat at the far end of the table, aware of Monica and Daniel sitting close enough to watch my every move. Philip cleared his throat, unfolded the document, and began reading. His voice was steady as he listed the properties companies and holdings my grandfather had accumulated over a lifetime. When he reached the part naming the inheritor, the room quieted. All assets, including the Carter estate, Carter Freight Lines, and liquid holdings are left in full to my granddaughter Lauren Carter. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. My mother's hand shot toward her necklace, clutching the pendant as her face tightened. My father leaned forward, his jaw setting in a straight line. Philip continued reading, his tone unchanged. "A note to my son and daughter-in-law," he said, raising the page slightly. "Those who walk away from truth for comfort have already forfeited their inheritance." The words settled over the room with a kind of finality no one seemed prepared for. Some of the guests lowered their heads. Others shifted uneasily in their chairs. Monica's fingers curled against the table. Daniel's eyes narrowed as if he were trying to find the flaw in the moment. As people began to rise from their seats, my mother stood abruptly and stepped toward me. Her expression had lost any trace of softness. "You will regret this," she said under her breath, her voice low enough not to carry beyond our corner of the room. "You don't deserve any of what he built." I met her gaze without responding, aware that she was waiting for some sign of weakness. When I didn't give her one, she turned away sharply, the heel of her shoe striking the floor with more force than necessary. Outside, the wind moved through the estate's front gardens, carrying scattered petals from the floral displays set up for the service. The air felt heavier than the sky suggested, and for the first time, I felt the beginning of a shift I couldn't yet name. The truth my grandfather had lived by was about to be tested in ways I never expected, and as I walked back toward the house, I sensed that the calm I'd known for so long was coming to an end. The house felt different after the will reading, even though nothing had changed on the surface. The same framed portraits lined the hallway, the same quiet breeze drifted in from the ocean, and the same soft lamps lit the living room at dusk. Yet each room seemed to carry an unspoken weight, as if the realization of what my grandfather left behind settled slowly into the corners. I tried to keep the days moving in a familiar pattern, but the air felt heavier, and I found myself pausing in doorways without knowing why. The steadiness I had known for so long seemed to shift under my feet even before anything official arrived. A few days after the service, I came home to a white envelope sitting on the front doorstep. There was no return address, only my name written across the front in bold handwriting that didn't match anyone I knew. I bent down to pick it up, feeling the thickness of the papers inside. When I opened it at the kitchen island, the words at the top of the page made my stomach tighten. Notice of civil action stood out in sharp printed letters, followed by the names Monica and Daniel Blake listed as plaintiffs. I scanned the lines quickly, barely absorbing the formal language until the accusation became clear. They claimed I had manipulated my grandfather into altering his will, that I isolated him from them in his final months, and that the estate needed to be returned to its rightful heirs. The kitchen went quiet in a way I hadn't heard before. I read the notice again, then set it down on the marble countertop, needing to steady myself. The phone rang a moment later, and the timing sent a faint chill through me. When I answered, Harold King's calm voice reminded me that legal papers often arrived before conversations. He asked if I could come to his office in the morning to go through everything. His tone never wavered, and that steadiness helped me breathe again, at least for the moment. By evening, the story had already found its way online. News alerts popped up on my phone one after another as headlines spread across various sites. Reporters waited beyond the estate's gates, their cameras flashing like small bursts of lightning every time someone moved near the driveway. I stayed inside the house watching from a distance as they gathered along the sidewalk. Their voices carried faintly through the windows, each comment blending into the next. Inside the house felt too large for one person, the tall ceilings and wide rooms amplifying the soft hum of the central air. I walked through the hallways, slowly stopping once in the study, where my grandfather's journal still rested on the desk. The sight of it steadied me, even as the noise outside grew louder. The next morning I drove to Harold's office early. His building sat on a quiet side street far from the larger firms that catered to more public-facing clients. Inside the waiting room held a single receptionist and a closed door leading to his private office. He greeted me with a nod and gestured for me to sit at the small table where a set of documents had already been arranged. As he opened the folder, he explained the accusations calmly. My parents claimed they had tried to reconnect and were prevented from seeing my grandfather. They alleged that I interfered with his medical care and guided him into decisions he wouldn't have made alone. Harold listened carefully as I described the events leading up to my grandfather's passing. He made notes on a yellow legal pad, but didn't interrupt. When I finished, he folded his hands and said there was nothing in their claims that matched documented reality. He reminded me that the court would look at evidence, not speculation. I nodded, though the knot in my stomach stayed tight. Before I left, he told me to expect more attention from the media, that inheritance disputes often drew interest even without the family history mine carried. Outside, a reporter approached before I reached my car. The camera crew with him lifted their equipment the moment I stepped forward. The reporter asked if I had pressured my grandfather or restricted access in his final months. I stopped walking, met his eyes, and answered as clearly as I could. "I cared for the man who raised me," I said. There was no pressure of any kind. After a pause, I added only what felt necessary, then stepped into my car and drove away. The cameras followed until I turned onto the main road. That evening, my phone rang again, but this time the caller ID was blocked. When I answered, a familiar voice came through, smooth and steady. It was my mother. She asked if I was enjoying the attention, then paused as if expecting me to respond. When I didn't, she continued. She said the estate I inherited belonged to them, and that by keeping it, I had taken their life from them. Her voice never rose, but there was an edge beneath it that I recognized from childhood. Before I could say anything, she ended the call. I lowered the phone slowly, feeling the house settle around me with a quiet I hadn't noticed earlier. Later that night, I sat in the study again, staring at the journal still open on the desk. I ran my fingers along the edge of the cover and thought about the way my grandfather had filled each page. The ink marks were steady and deliberate, each line written in a hand that never wavered, even in his later years. I opened the journal to an entry written months before the end one I had read several times when I needed a reminder of his clarity. His words steadied me in a way nothing else could at that moment. I closed the journal gently and sat back in the chair, letting the room grow quiet again. The window stood open just enough to let in a faint breeze, carrying the scent of the ocean that never seemed to fade. The following days passed with a strange mix of routine and tension. Reporters remained outside the estate, their cameras trained on the front gate. Philip stopped by to check on the progress of the estate transition, though his visit was brief. He asked if I needed anything and reminded me that he was available whenever issues arose. I thanked him, though there wasn't much to say beyond that. The house felt too still once he left, as if the walls were listening for something I couldn't name. The first hearing was scheduled for a morning in early spring. The sky dawned with thick clouds that hovered low over the city, casting a muted light across the courthouse entrance. Several news vans lined the curb, their antennas raised like metal branches, and reporters gathered along the steps, speaking into microphones as people passed behind them. I walked through the crowd, keeping my pace steady, aware of the eyes that followed me up the stairs. Inside the building, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood. Harold met me near the courtroom door, handed me a copy of the day's agenda, and asked if I was ready. I nodded, though readiness felt more like a decision than a feeling. When we entered the courtroom, my parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Monica wore a fitted black dress, her hair neatly styled, and Daniel's suit looked as though it had been tailored for the occasion. They each greeted the cameras with practiced poise before turning their attention to the front of the room. As I took my seat beside Harold, I felt the same shift in the air that had filled the house after the funeral, quiet, but unmistakable. Reporters filled the back rows, murmuring in low voices as they waited for the session to begin. The judge's chair remained empty for a few minutes, the silence growing more pronounced as everyone settled. When the bailiff finally called the room to order, Judge Ellis entered with measured steps, his robes gliding behind him. He surveyed the room briefly before taking his seat. When his gaze landed on me, he paused, and there was a flicker of recognition, though I didn't know from where until he spoke. He acknowledged me with a small nod, then turned his attention to the case file before him. His voice was steady as he outlined the purpose of the hearing, the claims being reviewed, and the expectations for court conduct. The room quieted further, with each word the tension settling into a low hum that filled the space like a held breath. When the plaintiff's attorney began presenting his opening remarks, he spoke with practiced confidence. He described a granddaughter who had allegedly controlled access to her grandfather, guided medical decisions, and persuaded him to alter his long-held estate plans. His tone remained smooth, even as he painted a picture that didn't match the life I had lived. I listened without interrupting, letting Harold take notes beside me. When our turn came, Harold rose and addressed the court with steady, even phrasing. He outlined the documented evidence of my grandfather's clarity and independence. He referenced the records Philip had kept and the timeline of decisions made long before any health changes occurred. His voice didn't waver, and he never adopted a defensive tone. Instead, he focused on presenting the facts in the calm way he always used when something mattered. As the hearing continued, witnesses were scheduled, documents were reviewed, and next steps were set. The judge gathered his notes, spoke briefly with the clerk, and then brought the session to a close. When the gavel sounded, the room slowly shifted into movement again, chairs scraping softly as people stood. My parents remained seated for a moment, then rose with controlled poise. They didn't look at me as they gathered their things and walked toward the exit. Outside, the air felt different from when I arrived. The clouds had thinned slightly, allowing a faint hint of sun to filter through. Reporters called out questions as people left the building, their voices rising above the steps. I moved through the crowd, quietly listening as the sounds of the city carried around me. At the edge of the sidewalk, I paused before stepping into my car, feeling the first hint of what lay ahead. The next stages would bring more scrutiny, more questions, and more moments where the past and present collided. As I started the engine, I felt the weight of everything settle into place, steady and undeniable. A long road stretched ahead of me, and I sensed the shift in air, once more subtle but unmistakable. It was the beginning of something I couldn't yet define. In the days following the initial hearing, the shift that had been building inside me began to take shape. The house was quiet, yet the stillness no longer pressed in the same way it had right after my grandfather's passing. I spent more time in the study, not because I wanted to, but because that room held the clearest memories of him, the firm tone of his voice when he wanted me to understand something, the careful way he folded letters, the steady rhythm of his pen as he wrote in his journal. I found myself returning to those memories as the lawsuit grew louder around me, each accusation stretching farther from the truth. The more the case escalated, the more I felt drawn back to the lessons he'd taught me without ever raising his voice. Late one afternoon, after the reporters had retreated from the front gate for the evening, I sat at his desk and opened the journal again. The pages felt familiar beneath my fingertips, the kind of familiarity that helped center me in ways I hadn't expected. I read through entries I already knew by heart, noticing small details I had missed before the steady curve of his handwriting, the short pauses in spacing that revealed where he stopped to think. I didn't go searching for comfort, but something in the quiet words he left behind steadied me. I turned a few pages back to an entry written in the last month of his life. It wasn't long, just a note about truth being strongest when it is carried without anger. But reading it settled something inside me that had been restless since the funeral. As the light faded through the windows, I closed the journal and walked toward the balcony outside the study. The ocean air was cool as it drifted across the patio, and the sound of waves hitting the rocks below echoed faintly up the cliffside. I stood there for a long time, letting the evening settle around me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt a small shift, not a disappearance of fear, but a kind of clarity nudging its way to the surface. I didn't know what would come next in the courtroom, but I knew I couldn't let their version of the story stand unchallenged. My grandfather's journal was more than a record of his thoughts. It was a timeline of his decisions, his clarity, and our life together. The next morning, when Harold called to schedule a meeting, I felt more grounded than I had in weeks. His office was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that made it easy to focus. He gestured for me to sit and opened several folders laid out on the table. Inside, he had arranged medical evaluations, estate documents, and notes from conversations he had with people who knew my grandfather well. He walked me through each item, explaining how they reflected my grandfather's state of mind and decision-making. Listening to him speak, I recognized parts of my grandfather in the way he described those details: steady judgment, clear reasoning, deliberate choices. When Harold finished, he asked if there was anything else that could help establish my grandfather's intent. I paused for a moment before reaching into my bag and placing the journal on the table. The leather cover looked worn under the soft office light. Harold studied it closely as I explained its significance, that my grandfather wrote in it consistently, that the entries spanned years, and that his thoughts remained careful and measured until his final days. I didn't hand it over as evidence yet. Instead, I wanted Harold to understand its role in my life and how it reflected the man my parents claimed had been manipulated. Harold turned a few pages slowly, reading silently. When he closed the journal, he rested his hands on top of it and nodded. "This is meaningful," he said, his voice calm. "It won't replace legal documents, but it provides context that supports them." Hearing that eased a tension I hadn't realized I was holding. We discussed the next hearing, what might be presented, and how we would respond. Harold remained composed, outlining each step without dramatizing anything. His clarity mirrored the calm I felt while reading my grandfather's entries the night before. Later, as I left his office, the sun was high enough to warm the pavement. Cars passed along the street with a steady hum, and the air held the faint scent of citrus from the trees planted along the sidewalk. The ordinary rhythm of the city felt distant from the conflict unfolding in the courtroom, but it provided a brief reminder that not everything was defined by the lawsuit. I drove home with the windows partially open, letting the fresh air carry away some of the heaviness that had settled around me. In the weeks that followed, I kept a quiet routine. I woke early, walked the garden paths my grandfather once tended, and read through old letters he had kept in a drawer in his study. I avoided the front rooms when reporters gathered at the gate, choosing instead to stay in the interior spaces where the house felt more private. The more the case built around me, the more I leaned into the steadiness he had taught me, letting it guide my steps, even as the noise outside grew louder. A few days before the next hearing, I received another call from my mother. The phone rang once before I answered, and her voice filled the line with a tone that carried both impatience and certainty. She said they were prepared to set things right and hinted that the sooner I cooperated, the easier the process would be. Her phrasing had a practiced rhythm, as if she'd rehearsed it. I listened quietly, not interrupting. When she finished, I simply told her that the truth wasn't negotiable, then ended the call before she could respond. I set the phone down gently on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, letting the silence return to the room. When the day of the second hearing arrived, the courthouse steps were crowded again, though the crowd seemed more controlled this time. Reporters still gathered near the entrance, but their questions were softer, more tentative. I walked past them with Harold at my side, moving through the double doors into the quiet interior of the building. Inside the courtroom, my parents were already seated at their table, speaking with Jason Crowell in low voices. They didn't look up when I entered, though I sensed their attention shift in my direction. The hearing proceeded calmly, with both sides presenting documents and statements for the judge to review. Harold stood at intervals to clarify details or correct inaccuracies. He didn't raise his voice or argue unnecessarily. Instead, he focused on presenting the facts clearly. Judge Ellis listened attentively, asking occasional questions, his expression steady. My parents remained composed, though their attorney adopted a firmer tone as he tried to establish doubts around my grandfather's intent. Each time he pushed the narrative of isolation or interference, Harold countered with documented evidence, and the rhythm of the hearing unfolded in measured steps. Near the end of the session, Judge Ellis requested specific estate documents to be provided before the next hearing. His tone remained even, revealing nothing about his impressions. When he adjourned the session, the courtroom gradually emptied chairs, scraping lightly as people stood. My parents left first, their footsteps quiet on the polished floor. I remained seated for a moment, letting the room settle. The carved wooden panels along the walls reflected a soft glow from the overhead lights, and the steady hush reminded me of the early mornings with my grandfather when the world felt still. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, carrying the faint scent of rain. Harold walked with me toward the car, reviewing a few details that needed attention before the next court date. His voice was steady as always, his words brief but clear. When we reached the car, he assured me we were on solid ground, then headed back toward the courthouse steps. As I drove away, the sky darkened with the promise of evening rain. The windshield reflected the shifting light as I navigated the familiar route back to the estate. When I pulled into the driveway, the last of the reporters had already left their cars, disappearing down the road. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The house was quiet again, but it felt different from the silence that followed the funeral. There was a sense of direction in the stillness, now something just beginning to take shape beneath everything else. I walked into the study, set my bag on the chair, and placed my grandfather's journal on the desk once more. I didn't open it that night. Instead, I stood by the window watching the first drops of rain hit the stone patio. The sound was soft, almost rhythmic, and the house felt calmer than it had in weeks. A change was coming, though I couldn't yet see its full outline. The next hearing would bring more questions and more weight to the surface, and I sensed that the turning point ahead would reach deeper than anything that had come before. The rain from the night before had left a thin sheen across the stone patio, and for a moment the estate looked as if it had been washed clean. The air carried a faint chill, and when I stepped into the kitchen that morning, the house felt still enough to hold each sound carefully. I moved through my routine with steady steps, though my thoughts were already drifting toward the courtroom. The second hearing had been revealing, but I sensed that the next one would carry more weight. The journal rested on my grandfather's desk upstairs, its presence anchoring me even when I wasn't reading from it. I knew it would soon be needed as more than a personal keepsake. Harold called mid-morning to confirm the hearing time and to ask if I felt ready. His tone stayed even, a quiet reassurance that helped me focus on what mattered. After the call ended, I walked into the study and placed my hand on the journal for a moment before picking it up. The leather cover felt worn familiar. I held it as I would hold something that had guided me for years. I set it in my bag gently, knowing this hearing would be different from the others. At the courthouse, the stairs were crowded again. Reporters lined the walkway, though their questions sounded more curious than forceful this time. The sky overhead was a muted gray, and the morning breeze carried the scent of damp concrete. I walked beside Harold, through the crowd, keeping my steps steady and my gaze forward. Inside, the hallways echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the soft murmur of conversations from other cases moving through the building. When we entered the courtroom, Judge Ellis was already reviewing documents at the bench. My parents sat at their table, both dressed sharply, their postures straight. Monica's eyes followed me for a moment before shifting away. Daniel leaned toward Jason Crowell, who whispered something to them with the ease of someone comfortable in a courtroom performance. I took my seat beside Harold, setting my bag carefully at my feet. The day's proceedings began with a continuation of the evidence review. Jason stepped forward with a tone of practiced confidence, introducing a set of emails and staff statements he claimed showed my grandfather had become difficult to reach in his final months. Each time he presented something, Harold responded by directing the court to additional documents that clarified the context. The rhythm felt familiar. Now assertions met with quiet facts, speculation countered with records. Still, I knew the real shift had not yet arrived. When Jason presented his next argument, he shifted his tone, lowering it slightly, as if inviting the courtroom into a secret. He spoke about distance within families, about connections lost and regained, and then claimed that my grandfather had been shielded from his own son and daughter-in-law. His words carried an implication that felt heavy in the room. Monica pressed a hand against the table, and Daniel nodded subtly, their reactions timed as though rehearsed. Harold rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. He paused before speaking, allowing the quiet to settle. Then he told the court that we intended to introduce additional correspondence and personal writings from my grandfather to demonstrate his clarity and intent. As he spoke, he gestured toward me. My heart lifted in my chest, steady and certain. I reached into my bag and retrieved the journal, placing it on the table in front of me. Judge Ellis looked up, his expression attentive. Harold asked for permission to use selected entries for context regarding my grandfather's mindset during the period in question. After reviewing the legal basis, the judge allowed it, instructing Harold to present only what was necessary. Harold nodded and asked me to take the stand. I walked toward the witness chair with the journal in my hands. The air felt different as I moved, quiet, heavy with anticipation. Once seated, I placed the journal gently on my lap. Harold's voice remained calm as he asked me to explain what the journal represented. I told the court about my grandfather's habit of writing every night, how he recorded thoughts, reflections, and decisions with clarity and purpose. I described how he had given it to me as a way to understand his truth long before the end. Harold asked if I could turn to an entry dated within the final year of his life. I opened to a page where the ink had faded slightly, but remained legible. The words spoke of responsibility, of understanding what mattered, and of trusting judgment earned through years of careful living. I read the lines aloud, keeping my voice even, letting the meaning settle in the room naturally. As I finished, the courtroom remained still. Harold then asked about the final entries. I turned to a page written just days before his passing. The writing was slower, the letters slightly uneven but clear. It spoke of his estate, of his hopes for its future, and of the reasons behind his decisions. I read the entry as it was written without adding anything to it. When I looked up, I saw a shift in the room. Judge Ellis listened with a kind of attention reserved for moments that mattered. My parents sat motionless, though their attorney's expression tightened slightly. Harold asked one final question, inviting me to confirm that the journal had remained in my grandfather's possession until his death. I answered clearly, and with that, my testimony ended. Returning to my seat, I closed the journal and held it quietly in my hands. The weight of it felt different now, more present. Jason approached the stand, next, his tone sharper as he attempted to challenge the authenticity of the entries. He suggested they could have been altered, that anyone could write in a journal and claim it belonged to someone else. Before Harold could respond, Judge Ellis addressed the concern directly. He reminded Jason that the handwriting matched decades of legal and professional documents authored by my grandfather, many of which were included in the case file. The courtroom fell quiet as the judge continued noting that the consistency in tone and detail aligned with the man he had once known personally. By the time the hearing paused for lunch, a noticeable shift had taken place. The earlier confidence on my parents' side had softened into something more brittle. Monica gathered her purse slowly, her expression tight while Daniel spoke in low tones to Jason, his posture more rigid than before. Harold and I stepped into the hallway where he paused to let the crowd pass before speaking. He told me that the journal had strengthened our position in a meaningful way, though he kept his tone steady, avoiding any hint of celebration. We returned to the courtroom for the afternoon session, where the focus moved to additional estate documents and medical reports. Harold presented them carefully, explaining how each record aligned with my grandfather's steady decision-making. As the hours passed, I felt a calmness settle around me, as though the truth my grandfather carried so carefully was finally finding room to breathe. When the judge called an end to the day's proceedings, the room exhaled in quiet movement. Papers shuffled, chairs slid back, and people gathered their belongings. My parents left through a side aisle, avoiding my gaze. Harold placed a hand on the back of my chair briefly, then offered a few quiet instructions for the next hearing. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had thinned. A few reporters waited near the sidewalk, though their questions seemed less urgent than before. The air held a faint coolness as I walked toward my car, the afternoon sun filtered by a thin veil of clouds. As I opened the door, I paused for a moment, sensing the shift that had taken place. The day had carried a weight I could still feel, but it had also brought clarity. The journal had become more than a memory. It had become part of the voice my grandfather entrusted to me. I sat behind the wheel and rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine. There was more to come, and the path ahead would bring its own challenges. But something had changed. The turning point was closer now, just beyond the next hearing, waiting for its moment to unfold. The morning of the next hearing arrived with a stillness that felt different from the routine quiet of the estate. I woke before the alarm, sensing something in the air I couldn't quite name. The house was dim as I walked through the hallway, and the faint sound of the ocean drifted through the windows in a way that steadied me. I moved through the kitchen, poured a cup of coffee, and stood at the counter with both hands around the warm mug. The day felt like it held a weight all its own. By the time I stepped into the study to retrieve my grandfather's journal, the sky outside had already begun to brighten, casting a soft glow across the desk. I ran my hand over the leather cover once more before tucking it securely into my bag. At the courthouse, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Reporters stood farther back from the steps, speaking in quieter tones than previous days. The cloud cover made the building appear muted, with the tall windows reflecting a pale gray light. Harold met me just inside the entrance, carrying a slim folder under his arm. He nodded as I approached and asked if I felt prepared. I told him I did, though my voice sounded steadier than I felt. As we walked into the courtroom, the familiar wooden benches and polished floors felt more defined, as if every detail mattered in a way it hadn't before. My parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table, their posture controlled, and their expressions unreadable. Monica kept her hands clasped tightly, while Daniel leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the front of the room. Jason stood beside them, reviewing his notes with the same air of practiced confidence he carried at every hearing. When I took my seat, I glanced briefly toward the bench. Judge Ellis was adjusting his glasses, reviewing a stack of documents neatly arranged before him. There was a calmness in his expression that I recognized from earlier hearings, but today it seemed more focused. The bailiff called the room to order, and the low murmurs settled into silence. Judge Ellis began by reviewing the progress of the case and outlining the areas that still required clarity. His voice carried an even tone, though something in the way he paused between sentences suggested he was weighing each detail carefully. When he invited Jason to continue presenting the plaintiff's arguments, Jason stepped forward with a measured stride, his tone smooth as he repeated the claim that my grandfather had been isolated from his family during his final months. He referenced phone logs, unanswered messages, and a timeline he insisted reflected undue influence. As he spoke, I listened closely, noting the slight variations in how he framed the events. Each assertion carried an implication of control, painting a picture that didn't match the reality of those months. When he finished, Harold Rose calmly asked the court to allow him to address the claims and walked toward the evidence table. He began by reviewing the documented medical evaluations, each one confirming my grandfather's steady mental clarity. He then presented communication logs, showing that my parents had made minimal attempts to reach out during the period in question. When Harold paused, Judge Ellis glanced toward me. His gaze held a familiarity I couldn't quite place at first. Then he leaned back slightly, folded his hands together, and spoke with a tone that carried deeper weight than anything he had said before. He mentioned that many years earlier, as a young law clerk, he had worked under a judge who held a strong commitment to fairness, precision, and personal responsibility. He hadn't known then how much those lessons would influence his own career. But when he read the estate documents and saw Walter Carter's signature, he remembered the man who had shaped his earliest years in the courthouse. The courtroom grew still. Jason stopped leafing through his notes. My parents sat motionless. Judge Ellis spoke plainly, explaining that while personal connection did not dictate legal outcomes, the respect he held for my grandfather's integrity meant he would review every piece of evidence with the seriousness it deserved. His tone didn't favor either side, but the acknowledgement carried an unmistakable shift. It was the first time my parents' confidence truly faltered. Harold took this moment to introduce the letters my grandfather had written over the years, correspondence with colleagues, personal notes to friends, and a statement prepared in the months before his death expressing his intent for the estate. Each letter reflected careful thought and unwavering clarity. The words were measured, the handwriting steady, and the reasoning consistent. As Harold spoke, he asked permission to present one letter in particular. Judge Ellis agreed. I watched as the letter appeared on the evidence screen. It was addressed to Philip, written in my grandfather's unmistakable hand, outlining his concerns about future disputes and his desire to protect the estate from those who might challenge his decisions. The letter emphasized trust in the systems he had put in place and stated plainly that his choice to leave everything to me was deliberate. I felt the courtroom shift again as the words settled across the room. Jason stood quickly, objecting to the emotional weight of the letter, but Judge Ellis overruled him. He explained that the letter served as direct evidence of intent, which was central to the case. With that, the momentum in the room seemed to change. Harold continued calmly presenting the journal entries from earlier hearings as a complement to the legal documents, reinforcing the continuity of my grandfather's mindset. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. Jason called my mother to the stand, guiding her through a series of questions about her relationship with my grandfather. Monica answered with a soft tremor in her voice, describing attempts to reconnect and suggesting that I had restricted her access. But when Harold cross-examined her, he asked her to clarify dates, times, and specific conversations. Her responses grew less certain, her voice hesitating before each answer. At one point, he referenced a documented timeline showing that she and Daniel were filming in another state during the period they claimed to have visited the estate. Her expression tightened, and the practiced composure she carried into the courtroom began to slip. Daniel took the stand next, answering Jason's questions with confident certainty. He stated that my grandfather had always intended to divide the estate among his children. Harold approached slowly, his voice calm as he presented estate updates prepared by Philip over the past decade. They showed a gradual shift in my grandfather's plans, each update reflecting changes in relationships and decisions made in clear writing. Daniel attempted to refute the documents, but each time Harold produced a new piece of correspondence that contradicted him. The tension in the room grew thicker as Harold asked his final question. He pointed to a specific update dated 2 years before my grandfather's death, signed by my grandfather and countersigned by Philip. The document stated that the estate would pass solely to me. When Harold asked Daniel if he had ever discussed estate matters with his father during that period, Daniel hesitated, his confidence fading. The pause was brief but unmistakable. Judge Ellis took note. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere became heavier. The plaintiff's case seemed to contract with each new piece of evidence, while Harold's calm, steady approach continued to build. By the time the judge called for a brief recess, the shift in momentum was undeniable. When the hearing resumed, Judge Ellis invited both sides to present any final clarifications before the session ended. Harold declined, stating that the evidence spoke for itself. Jason attempted to introduce one more argument, but his tone lacked the assurance it once carried. After reviewing the schedule, Judge Ellis announced that closing arguments would take place at the next hearing. His voice remained even, but the significance of his words settled across the room with a sense of finality. As people gathered their things, my parents remained seated longer than usual. Their expressions held a mixture of disbelief and strain. The confidence they carried into earlier hearings noticeably diminished. I stood quietly gathering my bag and holding the journal close as I walked toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the air held the warmth of a fading afternoon. A few reporters stood at a distance, speaking softly into their microphones, their tones far less certain than before. Harold walked with me partway toward the street before pausing. He told me that today had shifted the path of the case in a meaningful way. His words were steady, not triumphant, but grounded in the weight of the day's events. As I drove home, the road ahead felt different, not lighter, but clearer. The next hearing would bring the final arguments, and a resolution would follow soon after. The turning point had arrived quietly, shaped not by a single moment, but by the truth that had been building with each careful step. And now, as the estate came into view through the car window, I sensed that the outcome ahead would reach deeper than anything before it. The end was approaching, steady and inevitable, carrying with it the justice my grandfather had trusted me to uphold. The morning of the final hearing carried a quiet I hadn't felt before. I stepped onto the balcony outside my bedroom, and the air held a cool stillness that made the ocean look darker than usual. The sky was a muted blue, and the horizon seemed to rest without moving. I stood for a moment, letting the breeze shift around me. It felt like the estate itself understood what the day would bring. When I walked back inside, I reached for my grandfather's journal resting on the desk. I held it for a moment before placing it carefully in my bag. The weight of it felt steady in my hands. The courthouse steps were less crowded than earlier hearings, though a few reporters still waited near the entrance, their cameras angled toward the doors. Their voices were quieter, almost subdued, as if they sensed the shift in the case. Harold greeted me just inside the foyer, his expression calm and focused. He carried a small folder and gave a slight nod toward the courtroom door. We walked together down the hallway, our footsteps echoing softly along the polished floor. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was noticeably still. My parents sat at their usual table, their posture tense, their eyes fixed forward. Monica clasped her hands tightly, her shoulders slightly raised. Daniel leaned back in his chair, but the set of his jaw revealed more tension than ease. Jason spoke with them quietly, though his tone lacked the confidence he carried in earlier hearings. He held a stack of papers, but didn't move through them with the same smooth assurance. When Judge Ellis entered the room, shifted immediately into silence. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and reviewed the notes in front of him before inviting both sides to begin their closing statements. Jason stood first, walking to the center of the room with a careful, deliberate stride. His voice carried a practiced steadiness as he repeated the claims of undue influence and restricted access. He spoke of strained family ties and lost opportunities for reconciliation. Though his tone aimed for conviction, there was a noticeable restraint in his delivery. When he finished, he returned to his seat without looking at my parents. Harold rose next. He approached the center of the room with an ease that reflected the weeks of careful preparation behind us. His voice remained even as he revisited the documented timeline of my grandfather's decisions, the letters he had written, and the medical evaluations that confirmed his clarity. Harold didn't raise his voice or emphasize any point with unnecessary force. Instead, he let the weight of the evidence speak for itself. He concluded by stating that my grandfather's intentions were unmistakable, and that the estate had been entrusted to me not by manipulation, but through deliberate and thoughtful choice. When Harold returned to the table, the room fell into a stillness that seemed to stretch longer than usual. Judge Ellis rested his hands on the bench and took a measured breath. His expression was calm as he reviewed the documents once more. The light from the tall windows cast a soft glow across the room as people waited quietly for him to speak. He began by outlining the elements required to prove undue influence, noting that each claim must be supported with clear, convincing evidence. He reviewed the medical reports, the timeline of events, and the personal correspondence introduced in earlier hearings. Each point was addressed with the same steady tone, one that carried the weight of a man who had spent decades listening to truth and certainty in courtrooms just like this one. When he finished reviewing the case, he paused long enough for the room to settle into absolute silence. Then he announced his ruling. He stated that the plaintiffs had not provided evidence showing that I had influenced my grandfather's decisions or restricted his access in any meaningful way. He went on to say that the estate documents, letters, and personal writings clearly demonstrated my grandfather's intent. His voice never sharpened or rose, but the clarity of his words filled the room. He ruled that the will would stand exactly as written. The estate belonged solely to me. The moment hung in the air, and for a brief second, no one moved. A soft murmur rose from the back of the room as reporters scribbled notes or lifted their microphones slightly. My parents sat still, their expressions suspended between disbelief and realization. Monica's shoulders lowered slowly, her hands unclasping just enough for her fingers to grip the edge of the table. Daniel stared straight ahead, the lines around his mouth tightening. The sound of the gavel broke through the quiet with a final sharp echo. People began to rise from their seats, gathering their things with soft movements. Harold closed his folder and looked at me with a quiet nod. "It's done," he said, his tone steady but gentle. I took a breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. As I stood to leave, my mother stepped into my path. Her voice was low but strained as she said, "You think this will hold?" The tremor in her tone lingered beneath the words. Daniel stood behind her, his eyes avoiding mine. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stepped back enough to create space between us. My mother's expression flickered with something I couldn't fully read, part disbelief, part frustration. I met her eyes briefly before turning toward the aisle. They remained motionless as I walked away. Outside, the air felt open in a way it hadn't since the start of the case. Reporters approached cautiously, asking how I felt or what I planned to do next. I paused on the courthouse steps, letting the questions fall quiet for a moment. The afternoon light stretched across the pavement, and the breeze carried the faint scent of nearby citrus trees. When I finally spoke, my voice felt calm. I said that justice had been served as my grandfather intended, and that his legacy would be honored. I made my way to the car as cameras continued to click from a respectful distance. When I sat behind the wheel, I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. The drive home passed quietly, with the soft hum of the tires and the muted radio filling the background. The closer I came to the estate, the more the tension of the past weeks faded into something quieter. When I arrived, the house felt different. The tall windows reflected the fading sunlight, and the front lawn appeared more still than usual. I stepped inside and set my bag gently on the table near the stairwell. For a moment, I stood in the foyer, letting the familiarity of the house settle around me. Later that evening, I walked into the study and placed the journal on the desk, where it had rested so many times before. I settled into the chair, letting the quiet of the room surround me. The weight of the day remained present, but it carried a different tone, now less tense, more grounded. The final ruling had been made, but a different kind of moment waited just beyond the courtroom victory. I sensed it as I sat there listening to the soft shifting of the house. Something remained unfinished, not in the legal sense, but in the personal space that existed outside the courtroom walls. And I knew that what came next would reach into a part of my life that the legal battle hadn't touched yet. That evening, after the ruling settled across the courthouse like a closing door, I drove home with the windows cracked just enough to let in the cool air. The sky was turning a soft amber as the sun lowered behind the hills, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, the estate felt quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months. I walked inside, set my keys on the foyer table, and let the silence settle. For the first time since my grandfather passed, the house didn't feel heavy. It simply felt still. I found myself moving toward the study without even thinking. The door was slightly ajar, and the warm lamplight spilled across the floor in a soft glow. I stepped inside and paused near the desk where the journal still rested. I slid my hand across the worn leather cover before sitting down in the chair he once used every night. The air in the room held the faint scent of old paper and polished wood, a familiar mix that never changed. I opened the journal to a random page and let my eyes rest on a paragraph he had written years earlier about choosing what allows you to sleep with a clear mind. The words were steady, almost calm, and reading them made the rest of the world feel quieter. My phone rang, vibrating against the desk with a soft hum. When I saw my father's name appear on the screen, I hesitated before answering. His voice on the other end was nothing like the confident tone he used in court. It carried a thin edge of breath, as though he had rehearsed what he wanted to say and still wasn't sure he could get it out. He told me he had stayed up the night before, reading through the journal entries the court had reviewed, and that he finally understood how long my grandfather had seen the truth in our family. His voice caught slightly as he said he never meant to become the man my grandfather warned me about, but somewhere along the way he did. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, only hoped I would hear the apology he should have given years earlier. I stayed quiet for a moment, listening to the faint static between us. It wasn't a simple call or an easy one, but something in his voice felt genuine, stripped of the rehearsed charm he used so often. I told him I didn't know what forgiveness might look like, not then, not yet. But I could tell he meant what he said, and that mattered in a way neither of us tried to define. He thanked me, his voice hardly above a whisper, and before we hung up, he said that I reminded him of my grandfather, not in how I spoke, but in how I stood my ground. Those words lingered long after the call ended. I set the phone aside and walked out through the back doors to the garden. The roses my grandfather planted years ago were opening gently in the fading light, their petals holding onto the day's warmth. I stepped barefoot onto the grass and moved slowly along the path we used to walk on quiet mornings. The breeze carried the faint scent of sea air, and for a moment it felt like the house itself was breathing again, no longer holding the weight of old wounds. I carried the journal with me and stopped near the wooden bench beneath the largest oak tree. I opened to the last page, the one he wrote just days before he passed. His final lines weren't long or heavy. They were simple, written in a steady but tired hand. He wrote about justice being more than rulings or documents. He wrote that real justice lives in the people who continue to believe in it, even when others don't. As I read those words, the breeze stirred the edges of the paper, and I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been wound tight since the day they left me at his doorstep. I closed the journal and held it against my chest for a moment. The estate, the court case, the noise, all of it felt distant, compared to the quiet certainty he left behind. My grandfather gave me more than a home or a future. He gave me a foundation built on truth and steadiness, something I carried into every courtroom moment and every breath that followed. The lawsuit had ended, but what stayed with me was the clarity he trusted me to hold. As the last of the light slipped beyond the horizon, I walked back toward the house, the grass cool beneath my feet. I knew there would be more conversations ahead, and maybe more moments that asked me to stand firm. But I also knew I was no longer standing alone. The truth had done what it always does. It reached back, just like he promised it would. Before I turned in for the night, I stood once more in the quiet of the study and looked at his portrait on the wall. The soft lamplight touched the edges of the frame, giving it a calm glow. I whispered a thank you, not for the inheritance or the victory, but for the way he taught me to live my life with dignity. The room felt warmer as I spoke, as though some part of him was still there, steady as ever. If you've stayed with me through this story, I hope it gives you a moment to think about the people in your own life who shaped you quietly, the ones who taught you how to stand when everything else felt uncertain. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe. I'd love to know you're out there listening.